Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for spending some time with us today. If you enjoy our conversations, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our work across the globe. In order to understand the current rise in global anti-Semitism and the seemingly endless stream of anti-Israel propaganda, it's important to understand exactly how we got here. Since the emergence of the modern Zionist movement in the 19th century, not only since the official establishment of the modern state of Israel, the idea of the reestablishment of the Jewish national home has been under siege. With me to talk about his new book, The Bloody Price of Freedom, and delve into the global terrorist, economic, and legal assault on Israel since its establishment, is B'nai B'rith Honorary President Richard Heideman, who held that role in our organization from 1998 to 2002. Heideman is senior counsel at Heideman, Noodleman, and Kalick, and serves as lead counsel representing American victims of terrorism in claims brought or pending against Libya, Syria, Iran, the PLO, and other organizations and financial institutions accused of supporting terrorism. He recently spent 4 years as president of the American Zionist Movement, the AZM, and is currently chair of the Israel Forever Foundation, having previously completed a 5-year term as chair of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Lawyers Committee, among numerous other Jewish groups. Richard, thank you so much for being here. Great to have you back with us.
Thank you, Dan. It's always great to be with B'nai B'rith International. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, the first question is a typical question asked of authors, and we're going to ask it of you as well. Why did you write the book, and why specifically now?
Dan, there's not only a great deal of continuing, emerging hatred toward Israel and the Jewish people as we see through anti-Semitism, but it has to be viewed in the context of anti-Israelism. It has to be viewed in the context, I believe, of anti-Zionism. People don't seem to understand the history. They seem to get a sense of the ancient history of the Jewish people, but not really of modern history. And I think that there's a predicate in modern history for us to understand how it is that all of a sudden, 70, 80 years after the end of World War II, here we're seeing these assaults, physical assaults, verbal assaults in the halls of Congress, in the press, on social media, as well as literally attacks on the Jewish people around the world. And I believe, Dan, that just like with B'nai B'rith International, we need a plan of action. We need to stand up. We need to speak out. And I think the only way to do that is to do it in an informed, intelligent way based upon fact and based upon law.
Well, you cover some of the ancient history, and you cover the history into the 20th century. But let's talk about the modern period. Well, normally we would say, let's start with 1948, but I'm going to start with 1944, 4 years before the establishment of the state. In 1944, the Arab League was created. Tell us how the creation of the Arab League actually started the ball rolling to what we actually are experiencing today.
Well, just a few months after D-Day, it became increasingly clear that the Allied forces would defeat the Nazis in World War II and, thank God, bring an end to the Holocaust, an end to the Shoah. In October 1944, the Alexandria Protocol was signed by a group of Arab dictators from Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon who gathered in Cairo. And it really is what led to the formation of the Arab League and anticipating the potential impending realization of the Zionist dream to reestablish a Jewish state in the ancient homeland of the Jewish people and in the area known as British Mandatory Palestine. The Arab League took a page from the Nazi playbook and they launched a propaganda-laden boycott campaign seeking to isolate and to starve the Zionist entity that would eventually become known as the Jewish state of Israel. In June of 1946, they created a propaganda committee that was entrusted with carrying out the objective to, and I quote, to convince the Arab peoples of the necessity of boycotting Zionist goods so that the boycott becomes the firm creed of every Arab, which he may most enthusiastically preach to all, and which he may defend faithfully and genuinely. I end quote. If we just look back 75 years, Dan, we can see that what has played out over those 75 years started someplace. And it didn't just start with ancient anti-Semitism. It didn't just start with the Nazi plan. It was continued by the Arab League, which replaced Nazi Germany. And we are bearing the results of that today because it has continued in an organized fashion.
After 1948, how did it play out in the early years of the state?
Well, as we know, in 1947, the United Nations adopted the Partition Resolution. It called for the creation of the Jewish state, called for the creation of an Arab state, called for special status of Jerusalem. In 1948, Israel declared their independence. And the opportunity to have declared at that time the independent state of Arab Palestine, consistent with the partition resolution, was in the hands of those very Arab countries that established the Arab League. Instead, they launched the assault on Israel from all sides, multiple countries, 5 countries, and you ended up with the War of Independence. Israel then encountered wars, as we know, not only the 1949, but then in 1956. In 1967 and in 1973. And things have emerged since that time in a different way, but we'll talk about that.
Well, let's talk about how international bodies, multilateral fora, took up this message, if you will, from the Arab League. And how did it play out, for example, in the United Nations? We start very early with the establishment of the UN Relief Works Agency, UNRWA, as it's known, to create a situation where today we've seen 75 years really of hatred that has been promoted within that particular body. But tell us more about how the international community took up this cudgel, if you will, and as it's played out through the years.
Well, I think we should look at a dual track. First of all, we should look at the role of the United Nations in establishing what I will call special status for Palestinian refugees. All refugees in the world are classified in, shall we say, one basket. And the general rule of law for refugees and the humanitarian rules of law are that where refugees go, they are resettled so that they don't remain refugees. Compare and contrast that to what we've seen with Palestinian refugees. The United Nations established UNRWA, and they did so specifically for the Palestinian refugees, and they didn't do a resettlement. Palestinians went to various countries. They weren't resettled. Instead, they were kept in camps largely. And part of the reason for the camps was to demonstrate that Israel was the villain, Israel was the perpetrator, Israel was the hater, and look at these people living in squalor in camps. Enough billions and billions and billions have been spent so that none of them need to be in squalor. But then you lose the example of holding up the pictures and of having a narrative. I want to add on the second track, The UN created, as B'nai B'rith well knows from our standing at the United Nations since the inception, the United Nations created these Palestinian committees, these divisions at the United Nations, specifically designed to, let's put it nicely, promote the interests of the Palestinian people. But the approach that they've taken has been to beat and beat and beat on the Jewish people, to beat on Israel, and to spend UN money, precious UN money, unlimited dollars over time to promote that Palestinian cause, but it also meant promoting the narrative. And the narrative has been one of hatred. I want to add something else about the role of the United Nations, because I commented already, Dan, on that period of time from 47, the partition resolution, all the way through the wars, and I stopped at 1973. As a result of Israel winning each of those wars, Dan, there was a shift. And the shift was to ramp up the diplomatic war against Israel, rather than just on the battlefield, to ramp up the diplomatic war. And therefore, at the United Nations in 1975, the Zionism equals racism resolution was adopted. Now, you and I know, Dan, from our joint work together and our so many discussions, that we both believe what's one of the worst things, maybe the worst thing in the world that you could call somebody. That is a racist. So at the United Nations, there was this concerted effort that continues till today to brand Israel and the Jewish people as racist, to brand Israel as an apartheid, criminal, racist state, and therefore to take the whole body of international law and turn it against Israel as the pariah, and rather than treating Israel as the victim of the Holocaust, the Jewish people as the victims of the Holocaust, rather than treating Israel as the victim of discrimination at the United Nations. Israel has been painted as the perpetrator, which has led to the whole line of occupation and the whole line of settlements and colonization and other attacks, including murder and maiming, without holding accountable the very terrorists who've rejected peace with Israel. So this diplomatic turn, starting in 1975 with the Zionism Racism Resolution, has followed a strange path, a bad path. You and I have talked about it in other discussions because it led to the Durban matter, which I know is something that's on our agenda today.
Well, let's talk about from 75. Durban is in 2001. So from 75, you have, as you mentioned, the establishment of these Palestinian committees. This grew out of the Zionism equals racism resolution. Arafat appears at the UN, and then all of a sudden it just moves into high gear. Let's talk first about what you call the misapplication of international law. We'll leave Durban aside for just a second and get to it in a moment. So you have Israel having an issue at the International Court of Justice dealing with its security fence. Today, you have the International Criminal Court, which is seeking to bring Israel into the dock to charge it with war crimes. How has this misapplication of international law affected, beyond the courtroom, how has it affected the activity of these anti-Zionist campaigns that we've seen proliferate really since Durban?
Well, Dan, I think we have to understand that with this Zionism racism resolution, the United Nations launched into this attack on Israel in a new way. It increased resolutions against Israel, sponsored by the Arab League and other countries, seeking to brand Israel as a violator of international law and totally disregarding the terror that was being launched against Israel. You mentioned Yasser Arafat. Let's put it in the context of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Their mantra is rejection of Israel. Their mantra is pushing Israel into the Mediterranean Sea. Their mantra is to demonize Israel in every possible way. And so, utilizing the vehicles at the United Nations, they gathered together conferences such as the Nairobi Conference, the UN conference to assess and appraise the status of women, held in 1985. And as you well know, my wife Phyllis was designated a B'nai B'rith International NGO delegate to the Nairobi Conference, the UN conference, and I accompanied her in the name of B'nai B'rith International. And we went to Nairobi, and we found on the grounds of Nairobi the worst forum of hatred toward Israel and the Jewish people. Signs about Israelis as murderers, signs about the taking of blood at Passover. And there on the grounds of the United Nations, the whole issue of terror against Israel was ignored. The whole issue of Israel having the right to stand up against the terror was ignored. You have to fast forward through 1985, when the United States took the position that if Zionism, racism remained in the outcome document of the Nairobi conference, the United States would walk from the conference, and indeed it was removed from the conference outcome document. The United Nations itself abrogated Zionism, racism in the 90s, but let's remember the launch using terror and rejectionism of Israel, the launch against Israel of the first Intifada, and then the second Intifada, which launched in September 2000. So when we went to Durban in 2001, we were already in the midst of the second Intifada. We were seeing the use of terror in the form of suicide bombings, Kalashnikovs, buses blown up, people sitting at tables in their hotels or in their homes blown up, in restaurants blown up, and the world really didn't seem to care. And at the United Nations, they kept attacking Israel for defending herself. Now, every nation in the world, Dan, has the inalienable right, secure under international law, to defend herself. In fact, I'm one of those who believe that the prime obligation of a country is to protect and defend her people. So Israel, as a member state of the United Nations, in the family of nations since 1949, should be given the right, like every other nation state, to defend her people. And as a result of the launch of the second Intifada and the terrorism infiltration into Israel, Israel did something that it had considered previously, but finally had to do, and that is the construction of what I call the terrorism prevention security fence, what the world prefers to call the apartheid wall, as a separation barrier between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The purpose was to fence out the terrorists and to protect everybody in Israel, including workers and visitors, as well as residents from all walks of life and all religions. And as a result of the construction of that terrorism prevention security fence, in 2003, while the second Intifada was still raging, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution referring, Dan, to the International Court of Justice at The Hague, the question of the legality or the legal consequences of Israel's construction of the wall. And in 2004, the UN International Court, called the International Court of Justice, issued an advisory opinion, which was supposed to be advisory. In the United States, our judges don't give advisory opinions. It's not permitted for courts to give advisory opinions. But the International Court of Justice on July 9th, 2004, issued an advisory opinion castigating Israel not paying attention to the reason for the construction of the fence and wall. And the reason I say fence and wall is that about 4 to 6% of the barrier is a concrete area in order to stop attacks by bullets and by grenades and by Kalashnikovs and by even missiles. But 90-some% is a fence. And the decision of the International Court of Justice was to brand Israel in violation of international law. What happened after that is countries around the world, including, by the way, the United States, one of the federal courts of appeals, in the UK, at the UN, and in various countries around the world, they began citing the International Court of Justice advisory opinion as if it were international law. And that hijacking of international law continues today.
Well, we see it now with the International Criminal Court, and there was a new prosecutor. We'll see what happens. But the principle is the same. The principle is to hang Israel out to dry in a legal setting. Let's go to 2001, because we've referenced Durban, extremely important in terms of what we see today with contemporary anti-Semitism. And as then president of B'nai B'rith International, you led the Jewish caucus at that infamous 2001 UN Durban conference in South Africa, and you led the walkout from it. In September of this year, we highlighted the events, notorious anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bigotry, with a special series, Durban Revisited, on JBS, during which you spoke about your experiences there. How does Durban fit into the narrative you describe in your book? How central is Durban to what we're seeing today, 20 years later, with the issue of the occupation and apartheid, the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions? Why does that conference loom so large today?
Well, Dan, earlier we talked about the Nazi playbook, and we talked about that becoming the playbook, shall we say, for the Arab League. That Arab League has continued, in effect, boycotting Israel and promoting, working with the United Nations and using the United Nations as a vehicle to castigate Israel. The Arab League has led the way of an economic boycott, an academic boycott, boycotts on the college campuses, a boycott in every way, including labeling and other matters. By calling together the Durban Conference at the United Nations. It was called, and the unofficial name is the UN Conference Against Racism. The purpose of the conference was to address the ills of racism. And although Phyllis and I had gone to Nairobi, as I said earlier, and we found this terrible, hateful situation, and we thought we were well prepared to go to Durban. You're correct. As president of B'nai B'rith International, and at the time as chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations United Nations Committee, in that dual capacity, I was asked to be the head of delegation, and I served in that role, both for B'nai B'rith International and the other Jewish organizations. When we arrived in Durban, we found a hate fest. You cannot imagine what it was like to arrive and walk through and literally be spat upon, literally be called to your face by crowds, a murderer, literally be called to say the Jews have arrived. I mean, it's just really unconscionable to believe that at a United Nations forum, at a United Nations conference, there was all of the hatred, and I've only given you a small sense of it because I can't show you the pictures. I can't show you the kafiyas. I can't show you the crowds. There are photos of it, and Durban Revisited, sponsored by B'nai B'rith and broadcast on JBS TV, does show some of those photographs. So at Durban, during the Second Intifada, there was an extension of the Arab League playbook that took the form of an outcome document called the Durban Declaration as a result of the Durban program. And that has become embodied by countries around the world, adopted at Durban and later ratified at the United Nations and utilized by the UN Human Rights Council to continue to say Israel is an international law violator. Israel must be rejected. Israel must be demonized. Israel must be held accountable without anybody understanding that what Israel has tried to do, forced to do, is take the axe to defend her people. So over the last 20 years, the playbook from Durban has played out with these academic boycotts, an economic boycott, an electronic boycott. We called it the electronic intifada. And over the 20 years, you've seen more terror attacks. You've seen the launching of missiles from Gaza. And just recently in May of this year, over 4,000 missiles launched from Gaza. But who gets attacked at the United Nations? It's not Hamas in Gaza. It is Israel for responding and defending to 4,000 attacks. What country in the world would put up with it? Not one country in the world, but the United Nations expects Israel to put up with it. And so over 20 years, there has been this bashing. It's well funded, and it has penetrated the college campuses because that was part of the Durban program. That was part of the plan. And this playbook is one that is in effect today. The seeds of hate are enormous, and it infiltrates textbooks around the world, Holocaust denial, Holocaust distortion, and the accusation, I repeat, that Israel and the Jews and the Zionists, all of us being treated the same, are an apartheid, racist, criminal people. And therefore, it has become acceptable to spit. It has become acceptable to accuse. If they can do it at the United Nations, and if they can do it in official programs that are rolled out in a whole propaganda campaign, that propaganda has caused people to change their minds. The court of public opinion today is against Israel, and they utilize references, citations, we call it in the law, to the International Court of Justice opinion. We end up, therefore, today, 20 years later, looking back at Durban, but we have to look back at Durban, I believe, in the context of the work of the Arab League. You know, Dan, I want to, however, make sure it's clearly understood. There has been a break. The break is the Abraham Accords, because who could have imagined that last year, 4 countries of the Arab League would join Egypt, join Jordan, that earlier went into peace agreements with Israel. Who could have imagined that in a short span of approximately 4 months, 4 countries of the Arab League signed normalization agreements with Israel? By the way, the UAE was the worst perpetrator of the Arab boycott. They were cited by the U.S. Department of Commerce every year, I believe, every year. And they were the first country to sign. And we have to applaud the UAE and Ambassador Otaiba here in Washington, for the leadership that he, working with the State Department, working with the Prime Minister's office, working with Ambassador Dermer, Prime Minister Netanyahu, working with Ambassador David Friedman, working with Jared Kushner, working with President Trump, that these countries led the way to create the Abraham Accords. It is the single most important historic break in the relationship between Arab countries and Israel and the Jewish people in our lifetimes. And hopefully it will show us pictures in the future of more doves of peace flying around, because as it shows on the front of the book, The Bloody Price of Freedom, which you've asked me about today, There is this wonderful artwork from Udi Mario's of Blue and White Gallery in Jerusalem of this dove flying, because I'm indeed hopeful, as I know B'nai B'rith International is hopeful, that we will see a growth of the Arab League conversion, of adoption, not of rejectionism, but rather of joining with Israel in the Abraham Accords, or whatever the administration will prefer to call it, and that there will be hope for the future of real peace, because economic peace is important to the people of the world. Economic peace is important to the region. Stability is important to the region. And Israel is leading the way and helping to bring the technology, bring the cultural, bring the tolerance, bring the level of understanding together, working with her Arab neighbors. I would like to hope that someday there'll be Palestinian leadership that will not use terror, not use hate, not use boycotts, not use branding or accusations, or the international institutions of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, or the International Criminal Court to castigate Israel, but instead will applaud and join with Israel and the Jewish people to build a better future, and to do so recognizing that indeed Israel has paid the bloody price of freedom.
Well, how do you think the Jewish community can be proactive in optimizing these new relationships? There is no question that the fresh air, the breath of fresh air brought in by the Abraham Accords has shown all of us what can happen when there is goodwill to move ahead and to be future-oriented rather than looking back. And one would think that the Palestinians would have seen this. I mean, they're watching this parade go by, and yet, to a large extent, they're still very much in a zero-sum mode, as other changes have taken place, which are much more positive. So what do you think it is that we in our community can do to optimize and to advance what has happened over the last year?
I believe we have to hold terrorists accountable. We have to hold sponsors of terror accountable. We have to hold supporters and funders of terror accountable. And terror takes lives and destroys the fiber and fabric of communities and of families. There is too high a tolerance level for the terror emanating from the Palestinian organizations and supported by the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which was created out of the Oslo Accords by an agreement between Israel and the PLO, created the Palestinian Authority. That treaty has to be followed. That treaty set out a path, and later the United Nations adopted the roadmap, and it was accepted by Israel, and it was accepted by the PA. You're asking, what can we do to make it better in the future? And what can we in the American Jewish community, in the world Jewish community, and our global B'nai B'rith International community, what can we do? I think we need to, shall we say, go back to basics and remember that Israel is a country, and we are a people with great respect for the dignity of all men, women, and children, with great respect for human rights. Our own community attacks Israel and the Jewish people, often saying they're doing so as pro-Israel organizations. But when they keep attacking Israel, they give license to everybody around the world to attack Israel instead of giving Israel credit. The very divided voices coming from within our community, left, right, center, we can't agree these days on anything. Of course, it reflects, at least in the United States, the political divide, Democrat, Republican. It reflects in Israel, the political divide. It reflects around the world, the political divide between liberal and conservative viewpoints. We have to find a way to coalesce around the goodness of Israel, to, instead of demonizing demonizing her applaud her. And while some choose to criticize her, hoping to elevate Israel to a higher standard, what they're doing is continuing to encourage that Israel is not just held to a higher standard, but Israel is held to not just a double standard, but a triple standard, a quadruple standard, a gold standard to be the best. Well, we all want Israel and the Jewish people to be the best. So what can we as B'nai B'rith International do? We can lead the way in our communities around the world by speaking up, by standing up, by getting together with the diplomats who vote against Israel in the United Nations and reminding them that Israel is not the perpetrator here. Israel is the protector here. And to encourage them to take a look at, for example, the Abraham Accords. One other point, Dan. You know, we have, as I've already mentioned, this divided voice within the global Jewish community, pushed by organizations who choose to fundraise and push their agenda because it helps grow their mission, it helps grow their message. Why not redirect your message, I say to each of you, toward those who demonize Israel, toward those who reject peace? Let's remember, Mahmoud Abbas, who succeeded Yasser Arafat, wrote his doctoral dissertation on, in a nice way, I'll call it the fallacy of the Holocaust. Mahmoud Abbas refused year after year after year to come to the negotiating table with the President of the United States, with the Prime Minister of Israel. And since the elections in the United States and the change in administration, what we're seeing today is a return to the old playbook. We're seeing a return to the seeds of hatred. We're seeing to the return to the glorification of martyrs, as if that's somehow acceptable, to glorify terrorists. And Mahmoud Abbas and the leadership in the PA, which has been given billions and billions of unaccountable dollars, have spent that in this propaganda war against Israel. They should instead be spending it on building civil society, building government houses, building better roads and hospitals and schools with a not hate-filled educational curriculum. I think, therefore, if we in the Jewish world, who have the ability to articulate our views, could coalesce around what many organizations give lip service to, and that is support of the Zionist dream for the Jewish people to return with dignity and propriety to our ancient homelands, lands that we occupied 3,000 and more years ago, and lands from which we were expelled. If any other people, Dan, had returned to their ancient homelands, there would be great applause, standing up for the right of those people and their successes. But because it's Israel and the Jewish people, instead of being applauded, we are criticized and we are demonized. I think it's important to understand that if we remain silent, if we only talk to ourselves, we will not effect change. And B'nai B'rith International, as the global voice, has the ability in countries around the world and in every single community to reach to our young people and re-embrace them, reach to those on the college campuses and re-embrace them, reach to the community leadership from all walks of life and all religions, and remind them that it is Israel that has protected access to all of the holy places for all people since it has had to deal with war, now had to deal with terror, now had to deal with demonization. Nevertheless, it is Israel that really is providing great contributions to the world. And it's not doing so at the cost of the Palestinians. The Palestinians have leadership who need to lead, and instead of blaming Israel, they need to lead their own people. And the best thing they could do is embrace the principles of the Abraham Accords, embrace the principles that together we can make a better world, a better Middle East, and a better area that during a British mandatory Palestine, there was created this concept that led to the partition resolution, led to the state of Israel, and led to the wonderful accomplishments that Israel has developed as against all odds. All people deserve those accomplishments, and Israel supports that. The main body of people who reject it are the Palestinian rejectionist organizations who prefer to use terror, use demonization, and use the body of the United Nations to beat on Israel every single day. It's not fair. It has to be changed. And those in our own community who do not stand up for Israel have to share part of the blame.
Well, the book is The Bloody Price of Freedom by Richard Heideman. It's now available on Amazon via Geffen Publishing or wherever you purchase books. It's an important book to read and an important book as a reference to have on your bookshelf all of the issues relating to the history and to the current contemporary anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. It's all in the book. Richard, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. We appreciate your being with us today.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, thanks again to B'nai B'rith Honorary President Richard Heideman for joining me to discuss the bloody price of freedom and the ongoing struggle of Jews to live in peace and without fear. And thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this discussion, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. For my guest, Richard Heideman, I'm Dan Mariaschin. See you again soon.